And once again, I want to say greetings to each and every one of you, Aquaba, and welcome. Welcome to another round of Culturally Conscious Communications here on the LIB Radio, LIB TV, and LivingInBlack.com networks. My name is Keedy Owadu, aka The Conscious Rasta, and weekday mornings, you and I get together live. We come at you from 9 a.m. Pacific Time, that's 12 noon Eastern Time, 5 p.m. GMT, and 8 p.m. East Africa Time. We get together, 7 p.m. East Africa Time. We get together with culture, consciousness, historical perspectives, and we're doing book studies as well. Today's date is Thursday, the 17th of October. 2024 in the Western calendar. This corresponds to the year 6264 in the Kemetic calendar, to which we've realigned our cultural clock. Welcome to the 7th millennium. You have found your family in a peaceful place here on LIB Radio, LIB TV, and LivingInBlack.com. We're rocking it this morning, y'all. Ooh, it's been a busy morning around here. I hope you will appreciate, I hope you do appreciate what I've been able to accomplish so far this morning with the studies that we bring here on a regular basis here on LIB Radio. Today, we're going to go seriously at the upcoming book. The book is entitled Disaster Preparation or Preparedness for World Wars 5 and 6. The untold story of how the global economic and security order is shaping up for the 21st century. Disaster Preparedness for World Wars 5 and 6. Let's go into today's theme, today's topic, and let's see what we can put on the table and how relevant to your and my self-interest, mutual self-interest, we can make this discussion, this discourse today. So here we have, and I got not a bad amount of research pulled together for today's conversation as I am preparing to finish up the other book. I'm writing 2 books for this autumn season release. The other book entitled Living Superfood Solutions, using diet and nutrition to prevent and reverse chronic diseases. Today on Tech and Future Talk, to be an effective scientific futurist, it is necessary that we are serious students of history. We study the past to predict where the world is going. Key to our studies is determining how cultural perspective guides our outlooks and perceptions of future trends. Today we consider the power of culture and civilization to allow us to see dynamic history in context of change and to forecast what the future truly holds. So that's a rather ambitious project. I hope you would agree. For today's conversation, let's get right into the conversation, and hopefully we will inform, inspire, and excite people to see themselves as part of the dynamics of global change and global order. It's going to be a wonderful journey ahead. Let's get this party started. Now, real quickly, let me just mute this in my ear so I'm not hearing me talking back to me. And you are, of course, hearing me talk to you today. We welcome those of you. I see we have a pretty good audience on you now, tuning in to the program regularly. Great to have you with us. I see Texas Bandito has been prolific today. Paul Turk Stu Fam Interesting name. Chris Bustamante is in the house. Alter Ego in the house. Great to have you all with us here. One second. Let me wet the whistles so I can talk without having to talk through the crust. Again, today's program theme, viewing the world from distinct cultural biases. Let's go into the program. To be effective scientific futurists, I had mentioned it is necessary we become serious students of history. For several years, I have been using a particular citation from an article written by Samuel P. Huntington that appeared in the summer 1993 issue of Foreign Affairs, the publication of America's premier think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, what I'm sharing with you right now is excerpted from my book, The Road to Power, Chapter 2, called The Remaking of World Order. And I am citing the research of Samuel P. Huntington. And this book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, very important that we have these things in context. And just real quickly, let me just show you the cover of The Road to Power, 7 Steps to an African Global Order. Samuel P. Huntington is not the only one allowed to think about global order for the future. That is one of the early books that I wrote. This is book number, I think, 21. And this is book number 53, Forged by Fire, Post-COVID African Healthcare and Sovereign Development. And right now today's study comprises book number 55. So let's go into this. The severity of the consequences that are inferred within this following excerpt should absolutely not be underappreciated when we consider how the, quote, New World Order, unquote, agenda has progressed so far in the waning years of the 20th century. So this appeared again in The Road to Power, which was published right at the end of the 20th century, 1999. Here's what Samuel P. Huntington wrote that I'm quoting from. Civilization identity will be increasingly important in the future, and the world will be shaped in large measure by the interactions among 7 or 8 major civilizations. These include Western, Confucian, also known as Sino, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox, Latin American, and possibly African civilization. He wrote those words, not me. The most important conflicts of the future will occur along the cultural fault lines separating these civilizations from one another. Why will this be the case? First, differences among civilizations are not only real, they are basic. Civilizations are differentiated from each other by history, language, culture, tradition, and most important, religion. The people of different civilizations have different views on the relations between God and man, the individual and the group, the citizen and the state, parents and children, husband and wife, as well as differing views of the relative importance of rights and responsibilities, liberty and authority, equality and hierarchy. These differences are the product of centuries. They will not soon disappear. They are far more fundamental than differences among political ideologies and political regimes. Differences do not necessarily mean conflict, and conflict does not necessarily mean violence. Over the centuries, however, differences among civilizations have generated the most prolonged and the most violent conflicts. That is excerpted from the Foreign Affairs article entitled Clash of Civilizations with a question mark, which later evolved into the book. That article came out in Foreign Affairs in 1993, summer edition, and then the book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, comes out in 1996. One of the most important books in my arsenal of understanding global and political affairs. This book is spectacular. And as I'm opening the book, I wore out highlighter pens in writing this book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. Just highlights for days. Let me just share with you, when I highlight something, the relative importance of it. I just randomly opened to page 304, which I actually had a bookmark in there, so it wasn't so random. I randomly opened to page 304, and here's what I write as double highlights. Means these are the most important of the important parts. From page 204, far more significant than economics and demography are problems of moral decline, cultural suicide, and political diversity. Let me see, because the text is very small here. And political disunity in the West. I'll repeat, far more significant than economics and demography are the problem of moral decline, cultural suicide, and political disunity in the West. Often pointed to manifestations of moral decline include 1. Increases in antisocial behavior, such as crime, drug use, and violence generally. 2. Family decay, including increased rates of divorce, illegitimacy, teenage pregnancy, and single-parent families. 3, at least in the United States, a decline in social capital, that is, membership in voluntary associations and the interpersonal trust associated with such membership. 4, general weakening of the work ethic and the rise of a cult of personal indulgence. And 5, decreasing commitment to learning and intellectual activity, manifested in the United States in lower levels of scholastic achievement. Skipping forward to the next page, I'm going to share one more excerpt, one long paragraph, page 205. Again, the chapter entitled The West Civilizations and Civilization. Interesting chapter title. He wrote, a more immediate and dangerous challenge exists in the United States. Historically, American national identity has been defined culturally by the heritage of Western civilization and politically by the principles of the American creed, on which Americans overwhelmingly agree: liberty, democracy, individualism, equality before the law, constitutionalism, private property. In the late 20th century, both components of American identity have come under concentrated and sustained onslaught from a small but influential members of intellectuals, from a small but influential member of intellectually intellectuals and publicists. Excuse me. My eyes are struggling with a small text as well as clearing my throat. Here we continue. They have determined, in the words of one of their reports, the quote, systematic bias toward European culture and its derivatives, unquote, in education and the dominance of the European American monoculture perspective. The multiculturalists are, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said, very often ethnocentric separatists who see little in the Western heritage other than Western crimes. I think Arthur Schlesinger was talking about me when he made that statement. I'll repeat. The multiculturalists are, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said, quote, very often ethnocentric separatists who see little in the Western heritage other than Western crimes, unquote. Their mood is one of divesting Americans of the sinful European inheritance and seeking redemptive infusions from non-Western cultures. This multicultural trend also manifested in a variety of legislation that followed the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, and in the 1990s, the Clinton administration made the encouragement of diversity one of its main goals. Very interesting. Very interesting. Samuel P. Huntington, I think he did a very superb job of writing this book for the benefit of white/Western dominance and hegemony and game theory. I give him credit for that. I can appreciate someone who's good at their job, even if the fundamental crux of what they're writing is in opposition to the ideologies that I would want to adhere to for myself, my family, my community, and the future collaboration. Again, one of my great complaints about this perspective and this book is it's all centered around war and conflict. No. We envision a world where war and conflict no longer exist, where cultures appreciate their diversity. They celebrate the distinctions that separate them one from another. And when necessary, they collaborate, cooperate to create a world of abundance for all of the children. Let's keep going forward. Let's talk about these problems. Again, today's program theme, viewing the world from distinct cultural biases. Let's go into this topic of the Stockholm Syndrome. And I welcome you, our listening audience, to join the conversation as well. Let's talk about the Stockholm Syndrome. I want to put up a link for those of you who are following along so that you can have access to some critical research that we're going to be sharing today. This first link I'm going to put up, I hope it fits in one chat here on Rumble, and I think it will. Let me just post it here. And it didn't all fit, or did it? Yes, it did. So this is from Healthline, written by Kimberly Holland, November 2019. And here's what she had to say. Or here's what she wrote. Again, the title, What is Stockholm Syndrome and Who Does It Affect? By Kimberly Holland. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological response that causes survivors of abuse to sympathize with their abuser. It's considered a coping mechanism, not a mental health diagnosis. Stockholm Syndrome is commonly linked to high-profile kidnappings and hostage situations. Aside from famous crime cases, regular people may also develop this psychological condition in response to various types of trauma. In this article, we'll take a closer look at what exactly the Stockholm Syndrome is, how it's got its name, the types of situations that may lead to someone developing the syndrome, and what can be done to treat it. What is Stockholm Syndrome? Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological response. It occurs when hostages or abuse victims, or I would say victims of systematic capture and enslavement over the course of hundreds of years, bond with their captors or abusers. This psychological connection develops over the course of the days, weeks, months, or even years, or even centuries of captivity or abuse. With this syndrome, hostages or abuse victims may come to sympathize with their captors. This is the opposite of the fear, terror, and disdain that might be expected from the victims in these situations. Over the course of time, some victims do come to develop positive feelings toward their captors. They may even begin to feel as if they share common goals and causes. The victim may begin to develop negative feelings toward the police or authorities. They may resent anyone who may be trying to help them escape from the dangerous situation they're in. This paradox does not happen with every hostage or victim, and it's unclear why it occurs when it does. Many psychologists and medical professionals consider Stockholm Syndrome a coping mechanism or a way to help victims handle the trauma of a terrifying situation. The history of the syndrome may help explain why that is. What is the history? Episodes of what is known as Stockholm Syndrome have likely occurred for many centuries, many decades, even centuries, she writes. But it wasn't until 1973 that this response to entrapment or abuse came to be named. That's when two men held 4 people hostage for 6 days after a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. After the hostages were released, they refused to testify against their captors and even began raising money for their defense. After that, psychologists and mental health experts assigned the term Stockholm Syndrome to the condition that occurs when hostages develop an emotional or psychological connection to the people who held them in captivity. Despite being well known, however, Stockholm Syndrome is not recognized by the new edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This manual is used by mental health experts and other specialists to diagnose mental health disorders. She continues, and I reading from the article, What is Stockholm Syndrome and Who Does It Affect, written by Kimberly Holland from Healthline, November 2019. She continues, what are the symptoms? Stockholm Syndrome is recognized by 3 distinct events or symptoms. 1, the victim develops positive feelings toward the person holding them captive or abusing them. 2, the victim develops negative feelings toward police, authority figures, or anyone who might be trying to help them get away from their captor. They may even refuse to cooperate against their captor. And 3, the victim begins to perceive their captor's humanity and believe they have the same goals and values. The Stockholm Syndrome. And I don't think any one of us could deny that many people, Mesoamericans, African people, Southeast Asians or South Asians, Many groups of people have been abused, horrifically abused over the course of many decades, even centuries, yet still have adopted wholly and completely the values, the cultural values of the ones who so abuse them. As a person of African heritage here in the United States, I feel that my people may be about the worst case of Stockholm Syndrome available for the world, but we're not the only ones. Latin Americans, many of whom referred to as Mesoamericans, which is not an appropriate term because the term America comes from the outside. They regarded themselves as Aztec, Mayan, Inca, Hopi, Navajo, Arapaho, Lakota, Iroquois, and many other great nations have been captured, have submitted to the language, the religion, to the cultural traditions of their capturers. Let's go to one. I only used one AI search for today's conversation. I had so much background in all of this that I just backed away, but I did go to use the Brave browser's AI search looking for Stockholm Syndrome definition. It returned the following. Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon where individuals, typically hostages, develop positive feelings toward their captors, despite being held against their will and facing potential harm or danger. This phenomenon was first identified after a 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, where 4 bank employees were held hostage for 6 days. Key characteristics of Stockholm Syndrome include 1. Refusal to cooperate with authorities. Hostages may resist or refuse to cooperate with law enforcement or rescue efforts. Point 2, belief in captors' humanity. Hostages may begin to see their captors as human beings rather than threats and develop empathy towards them. Point number 3, emotional bonds. Hostages may form an emotional bond, emotional connection with their captors, which can lead to feelings of gratitude, loyalty, or even romantic attachment. Point 4, negative feelings toward authorities. Hostages may develop negative attitudes toward law enforcement or rescue teams, perceiving them as a greater threat than their captors. Next, they go into examples of the Stockholm Syndrome. First example given, that of Patty Hearst, an heiress to the Hearst family wealth, was taken hostage by the Symbionese Liberation Army in 1974. She later joined the group and participated in bank robberies, claiming to have developed feelings of sympathy and loyalty toward her captors. Example number 2. In the film Sugarland Express, a police officer taken hostage by a couple develops positive feelings toward them despite being aware of the danger they pose. Next, the return from the AI search on Brave talks about debate and controversy. Some argue that Stockholm Syndrome is a genuine psychological phenomenon, while others consider it a myth or an exaggeration. Well, from the perspective of African people, African Americans, Africans in the diaspora, having adopted all 6 of the cultural axioms of our capturers, having adopted the Bible as our code of ethics, despite the fact that that same Bible fueled the code of ethics of those who brutalized us for centuries? I say beyond question, the Stockholm Syndrome is very, very real. Point two, critics point out that the phenomena is rare and often sensationalized in media and popular culture. Point three, researchers have questioned the legitimacy of Stockholm Syndrome as a distinct psychological disorder, suggesting it may be an extreme manifestation of normal coping mechanisms. In conclusion, Stockholm Syndrome is a complex and controversial phenomenon that highlights the intricate dynamics between hostages and captors. While its existence is debated, it remains a fascinating topic for psychological and sociological study. What do you think, listening audience? Are you out there today? Do you have an opinion on whether or not the Stockholm Syndrome is real? Do you have an opinion on whether the Stockholm Syndrome is real? I'd love to hear you or read your thoughts on this topic. Love to hear what you have to say. Personally, your opinion matters to me. If nothing else, we get everybody out there to at least hit the like button for today's broadcast? If you're not going to comment and participate, at least hit the like button. Let's keep going forward again. We're in the introductory chapter to the upcoming book, Disaster Preparedness for World Wars 5 and 6. Let's go forward with our research. Next, I want to share some of the research that I have created over the years. A book I published in 1997 was entitled Moving Beyond Race-Ism. Moving Beyond Race-Ism. And I titled it in the subtitle, New Strategies for a New Millennium. Again, 1997, right on the eve of the beginning of the 21st century, Western calendar. 64th century, actually 63rd century. No, 63rd century Kemetic time. We are in the 63rd century. It is the year 6265. That's the 63rd century. And the book was entitled Moving Beyond Racism, New Strategies. The chapter was entitled Culture Is. The new strategies I'm talking about, moving away from the hierarchy of colorism, which is what racism really truly is. It's really about colorism. And moving into a different understanding. It's not about color, it is about culture. Because even within black people, the Stockholm Syndromed black people in the United States, we can still find a hierarchy related to colorism. As the old folks used to say, if you're black, stay back. If you're brown, stick around. If you're tan, you're the man. If you're white, you are all right. Or they would say, if you're bright, you're all right. Which meant if you're white, you're all right. So, therefore, I came up with this book to give us a new fundamental paradigm. And I tell you, people, don't overlook the research in this book. It is so liberating. It is so transforming. The book is called Moving Beyond Race-Ism. Why did I say race-ism and not the traditional spelling of R-A-C-I-S-M? Because the ism is a suffix that means doctrine. And this notion of genetic identity, so-called race, is a notion that has created doctrine. And if you believe in the hierarchy of race, of colorism, then it's quite likely your behaviors will be conformed by the doctrine, what the doctrine has produced. So we don't want to be limited, unconsciously limited into thinking and behaving a certain way. As a child growing up, the darkest skinned girls on our block were mistreated by the other children. That's true. Mistreated. And when I think about it, I'm embarrassed that I dislike these two beautiful young ladies merely because their skin was sable black. They were beautifully black, Sudanese black, ripe, fully blessed by the sun, kissed by the sun. And we, the other children on the block, abused them for no more reason than that. That's embarrassing. I would never want to teach that to my children and or grandchildren. Culture is, this is from the book. So culture consists of 6 axioms. They are language, including what do we name our children at birth. My parents gave me a Scottish man's name. Do I look Scottish? Am I culturally Scottish? What links did my family have with Scotland? And the surname on my birth certificate, Howard, was the name of an enslaving plantation. They were fairly prolific because there was a whole lot of Howards. On my mother's side, Harristons. If you look across the United States at African families, there's a whole lot of Harrisons. There was some prolific breeders of their captives. Yes, they were. So culture is, first of all, language. What languages do we speak as Africans in America? I tell you, I know one thing. I've been to Africa 9 times, and I have encountered Africans, almost all of the ones that I deal with, speak at least 4 languages. At least 4 languages. I have one brother, he speaks 8 languages. And speaks them well, too. I've heard of others who speak even more languages. I myself have studied 8 languages, but I don't speak them prolifically. I can speak 3 languages prolifically, English, French, and Spanish. But I want to learn to speak fluently in Amharic, Tree, and especially in Kiswahili. That is a greater destiny than being locked into only the language of the abusers and kidnappers. Culture is, number 1, language. What is your name? Point 2, culture is religion / spiritual expression. Because some of us are challenged by this word religion. Meaning go back to league, meaning to bind. Religion, from the Latin phrase to bind. But religion is a unifying factor. There's no doubt about that. And the Western world, not the Western world, much of the world is dominated by the Abrahamic religions, all stemming from the same root. That root being the mythology of Abraham or Ibrahim. Isaac, Jacob, and all of that stuff. Don't ask me for details because I am not a biblical scholar. I read that book, tried to read it a 3rd time, finally I gave up. I said, man, this book ain't all of that. But for some people, the book has every answer to every question, even questions they don't even know need to be answered. So religion, spiritual expression. Many people are now starting to say, I am spiritual, I'm not religious. I understand where you're moving to, and I encourage such transformation, a paradigm shift. to realize that spirituality is an acknowledgement and an ordering of transcendence. I am not limited by the circumstances of my birth, the inheritance from my parents. I am not limited by many different things that limit us. I am a spirit being, an essence of the universe manifested in the physical form for this generation. Oh, I can relate to that. While I am myself an ordained priest of ancient Egypt, the sacred order of the sons of Ra, following the footsteps of Amenhotep IV Akhenaten, and following in the traditions of the Therapeutae who existed in the Nile Valley in ancient Kemet. So culture is, number one, language. Number two, religion, spiritual expression. Culture is, number three, traditions. What are cultural traditions? Style of clothes. Anytime you go to a cultural festival, you're going to see people dressing in the clothes of the culture that produced their ancestral line. You're going to, culture is, traditions includes music, very distinct musics from Eastern cultures of China, Japan, Korea, quite distinct in their traditions, their cultural traditions, quite distinct from the cultural traditions that black people in the Western society or white people in Western society would be formatting, binding them together as a people. Culture is traditions, holidays, celebrations. What did you do on the 4th of July? Or is it called the farce called July? Freedom Day. What did you do? Did you celebrate? How did you celebrate? What foods do you eat? Did you eat? Did you eat on 4th of July? Did you eat Thailand or Thai soup, Thai noodles, pad Thai? Or did you eat burgers and hot dogs? Tradition, culture is traditions, and we can identify a whole spectrum of traditions that identify with culture. So culture is, number one, language. Number two, religion, spiritual expression. Number three, traditions. Number four, culture is historical perspective. How do you feel about the teaching of liberation history within schools attended by black children? There is a war on cultural education in the United States from those who perceive themselves as losing in the national culture war for the soul of America. So therefore, they have labeled my history, my people's documented world history, my people's place in the world. They call that critical race theory. They made that term up. Critical race theory, which is intended to sound as negative as it possibly can. Critical meaning negative, race meaning that thing that separates one civilization from another, and theory meaning this is just something you made up. I don't cuss, but heck with them. I choose to hold on to African-centered historical perspective, Pan-African centered futurist perspective. I'm not going to let go of that, because to let go of that would be to die intellectually. And you're not going to murder me intellectually, making up terms like critical race theory. Culture is language, religion, spiritual expression, traditions, historical perspective. Historical perspective. This book, Disaster Preparedness for World Wars V and VI, is itself an example of the distinction of historical perspective biased by civilization. Just real quickly, this is kind of a summary of what the whole book goes through. World War One was the clash among empires. World War II was an attempt by fascism to develop and compete and become imperial hegemony. World War II was not a fight of freedom against non-freedom. No, it's not true, because in the United States military was heavily segregated. They were not free. Many of those who went to war in World War I and II were colonized by the powers that they fought for. They did not have any choice in that. So World War II was a battle of three fascist powers: Japan, Italy, and Germany, to take away the imperial powers of the British, the French, the Dutch. That was World War II. And they ended up drawing the United States in because the United States was already fighting in the war. It had ramped up a war-making industrial machine and was itself engaged in it, just like it is currently engaged in industrialized warfare in Ukraine and against the Islamic countries. World War III was the so-called Cold War. The so-called Cold War, that's a lie. It was not a Cold War. It was a hot war, a blazing war with fire and steel, bullets and bombs. That war was fought in South Korea, or in Korea. It was fought across Indochina with the Vietnam War. World War III was fought across Africa, from the Congo to Mozambique and Angola, South Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Egypt. The Cold War between Eastern Orthodox civilization and Western Christian civilization, the Marxism versus capitalism, was not a Cold War. It was a blazing hot war. A whole lot of people died in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, in the name of that so-called Cold War. It was World War III. It was a global war, and it was blazingly hot. Done explaining. So now you listen to news stories, and they keep talking about the threat of World War III, threat of World War III. Don't take them seriously. Don't take those people talking like that seriously about their ability of global analysis. Don't take them seriously. World War IV, from my understanding, really begins with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which was part of World War I, and the British assumption and the French assumption of the Ottoman Empire lands, and to some extent the Italian assumption, because North Africa, the Italians went in after the Ottomans were defeated in World War I. So World War IV then is the war against Islam. And because the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic empire, it came close to overtaking Europe, came close to smashing the Eastern European empires. In the book, I'll document this in much more detail. So therefore, there becomes a world war against Islam. The Balfour Declaration, the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, a democratically elected Islamic leadership overthrown and substituted by the West through their intelligence agencies with a CIA-backed dictator, the Shah of Iran. World War IV proceeds. We have this invasion of Afghanistan, partially by the Russians, which was not about Islam. It was really a battle of Marxism still. That's World War III, still lingering. But it now opens up the door for the conquest and the destruction of Afghanistan for several decades in a row. The United States enters and tries to mimic what the Russians could not do. Afghanistan, called the killer of empires, the British tried and were defeated. The Russians, the Soviet Union tried and was defeated. The Americans tried and were defeated in Afghanistan. The war against Islam proceeds from Afghanistan to Iraq, Iran, I'd mentioned already, Pakistan, the destruction of Libya, the destruction of Somalia, the destruction of Syria, the destruction of Lebanon, World War IV, the global war against Islam spreading across the Sahara Desert into the Sahel, wars encompassing, it went from Libya, spread through Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria, Somalia, I'd mentioned earlier, World War IV, even, and Islamic jihadists fighting in not Mozambique. Is it Mozambique? Yeah, Mozambique. Again, these will all be documented in the book. That's why I'm writing the book. So we're talking about historical perspectives. These world wars, World War V, the globalist war against the workers, middle class, and a historical perspective. World War VI is the alignment now and the opening skirmishes breaking out of the West NATO alliance versus the BRICS plus resistance. That's World War VI. Culture is morals and values. The moral code of Western Christianity, for which it has never seen a 10-year period of adhering to, is said to be the Ten Commandments, said to be the Bible, the teachings of Jesus. That's said to be, supposed to be the moral code. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not kill and kill and kill. Thou shalt not arm people who kill. Thou shalt not tolerate genocide. You know what I'm saying. Their moral code, they violate. Thou shalt not steal. Unless you're stealing land from 80 indigenous nations of the Western Hemisphere, then you can steal at will. Thou shalt not steal their gold. Thou shalt not steal their children and force them into labor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or thy neighbor's buttocks. The moral code of Western civilization, Christian civilization, the Ten Commandments, sucks. There are other moral codes around the planet: Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, indigenous spiritual expressions, the 42 positive affirmations of Ma'at, one of the oldest and most comprehensive moral codes ever to have been decoded. Well, we could bring Ma'at back into being. The Ten Commandments was like somebody with really, really bad memory trying to replicate the 42 positive affirmations of Ma'at. I have not. Moral and values. What type of civilization or cultural values has it now that women do not want to bring new life onto the planet? Crashing fertility, which has to do with everything, demographics, underwrites, everything related to civilizations, the past, present, and the future. But now, the women of South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Germany, Britain, Poland, Italy, Spain, they don't want to have children anymore. They don't want to make any personal self-sacrifices. They want to get their money. They want to get their education. They don't necessarily want or need a man as long as they have each other to affirm each other's stance of them men ain't no good. I've recently commented on this explosive new YouTube-based phenomenon called Pop the Balloon or Find Love. And this thing it's quite compelling. It's a great theme for a program, but it also exposes very clearly the blatant hostilities and anger and separateness of African American males and females. Oh, it's pretty rude. I can appreciate the producers for creating such a dynamic show, but at the same time, that show is exposing fade to black, the passing of a great race. I would love to talk to the producers. Maybe I'll try and open up a conversation with them. I'm not going on that show. In fact, I'm too old to go on the show. I'm old enough to be people's grandparents. It's mainly a show for millennials and for the hostility, exposing the hostility between millennial women and men. And why it's so difficult, if not impossible, for them to be able to find romance, especially in a game show. Culture is morals and values, and number 6 of culture is logical patterns of thought and analysis. It's logical that men and women would want to match up, to do what their parents did, produce life for the next generation. If the millennials have become so grossly selfish that they don't want to do that, it can be blamed on their parents, the baby boomers, and Generation X, who took the I, me, my syndrome to a whole new level, to where the society is now in danger of aging out and demographic collapse. That's the reality. Culture is logical patterns of thought and analysis, which even extends to patterns of thought and analysis reaching out to the entirety of the planet, that we call game theory. Game theory is the ultimate planetary global pattern of thought and analysis. Game theory. So next, I want to talk about what to expect from reading this book, from following this series of studies. And the previous book, Living Superfood Solutions, I did put that up. It is 22-part lecture series, workshop report series, 22 parts to it. I put it all in one big catalog. I'm going to post that up so people can have access to it. And it's great. Great. Living Superfood Solutions for Chronic Diseases. All in one book. The cost of, or all in one audio collection. The cost of getting that audio collection is less than a copay for one of the illnesses. And I describe numerous illnesses, so you do want that book. So, next, what to expect from reading this book. You will get insight. You will have your feet grounded on one or multiple of the fundamentals of scientific futurism. You will begin to be able to see in real time these patterns of conflict that arise in the world. You will understand why the Israel-Western alliance against Islam has not ended in the 78 years. Is it 78 years? Yes, it's 76 years since the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. That would be what, 52 plus 24, that's 76 years. Why the Israeli-Western conflict against Islam will continue as long as this clash of civilizations between Western civilization and Islam continues. And that one is predicted to last 100 Years' War. It's not the first 100 Years' War that's taken place amongst Western civilization. They have multiple examples of hundreds of years of warfare. Go back to ancient Kemet. Ancient Kemet, the Nile Valley civilizations, engaged in prolonged warfare against invaders from Persia, Greeks, Romans, the Hyksos, the Assyrians. They invaded the Nile River Delta over the course of thousands of years. Thousands of years. We're not at that point anymore, because even the risk of 100-year war against Islam, with them all nuking up, this puts a whole planet in peril of extinction level events. This book will realize the toxic limitations of nationalism. Now, I personally celebrate civilization identity. I do. And I think we should celebrate civilization identity. But we're going to have to realize that ultimately, if it continues along the course that it's on, dominated by Western civilization, it is centered around conflict and war. And as we look at the news headlines of the day and listens to these politicians vying for governance, dominance in our lives, we can see that their commitment to conflict and war has no real room for optimism that they are going to likely change in the short run. Comparing the blue tie candidate or the donkey party versus the red tie candidate or the elephant party, they are the same. When it comes to hating other people unlike ourselves, that's where they find their greatest solidarity and commonality. Why we need to change the course of history from conflict and war to sustainable development and appreciation of cultural diversity. That's a very important lesson you will get from reading this book. Because if we don't do that, we're doomed to annihilation. I want to talk about this background by showcasing two books that I think are very important to this book that I'm writing. Again, we're in the intro chapter, Viewing the World from Distinct Cultural Biases. The first book I'm going to mention is entitled The Iceman Inheritance: The Roots of Western Aggression and Violence. The Prehistoric Sources of Western Man's Racism, Sexism, and Aggression. This book is written by Michael Bradley, is the author of the book. Written and published in June 1991. And it's also the introductory chapter to the book was written by the distinct African historian Dr. John Henry Clarke. Wrote the preface to the book, the foreword to the book, written by John Henry Clarke. Again, The Iceman Inheritance: Prehistoric Sources of Western Man's Racism, Sexism, and Aggression. Let me just put up a link to that particular book so you can see it as well. Push that up in several places. And I'm going to read from it. Now, we got a good sized audience today, but nobody talking to me. What's up with that? What did I say? What did I do? This is critical work. I hope you do appreciate, love what we're doing here today. But being responsive is a good thing as well. Being responsive is a great thing. So here we go. Let me just put up the link so you can get access to the book. Is available at Amazon and other booksellers. And one more place, let me put up the book here. The Iceman Inheritance by Michael Bradley, with a foreword by Dr. John Henry Clark. Here's what a description of the book says in no small part. The Iceman Inheritance is the most glaring admission about the Europeans' attempt to dominate the world through racism. There are a large number of books on this subject, but the writers tend to hedge on the subject by inferring that in spite of the atrocities and the racism brought to this world by the Caucasian race, they have given the world some order, some technology, and arts and letters of lasting benefit. What the authors of these books do not take into consideration is that in spite of the contributions that benefit the world, Europeans, in their attempt at world domination, created a disastrous climate for the world's people. That is a brief description of Michael Bradley's book. And if you've never read Michael Bradley's book, The Iceman Inheritance, you owe it to yourself to fill in that gap. I highly, highly recommend the book. We continue. And just real quickly, we got a few more minutes. I want to talk about another of my favorite books. This book by Dr. Maremba Ani is entitled Urugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. This book, published in January 1994 by Dr. Maremba Ani, one of our favorite scholars. For those of you who are looking for the book, here is a link where you can get access to it. I'll share that link. For our Rumble family, there is the link to Urugu, and for my Facebook family, push that link up here as well. And also for the YouTube family, here is where you can get your hands on the book Urugu. And here, double check. Gotcha. Ooh, or did it get it? Let's double check. Okay, I have to do this in two parts because it's too long to fit on one. So there we go. There is the link for Urugu. Another critical read, a must read. It's a little tougher book to read. It's rather large, rather thick. Urugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior by Dr. Maremba Ani. Urugu removes the mask from the European facade and reveals the inner workings of global white supremacy, a system that functions to guarantee the control of Europe and her descendants over the majority of the world's peoples. It examines the influence of European culture on the formation of modern institutional frameworks through colonialism and imperialism from an African perspective. Urugu, a brief summary. Ani's 1994 work, Urugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior, examined the influence of European culture on the formation of modern institutional frameworks through colonialism and imperialism from an African perspective. Described by the author as an, quote, intentionally aggressive polemic, unquote, the book derives its title from a Dogon legend of an incomplete and destructive being rejected by its creator. Urugu, described in Dogon mythology by the people of Mali in West Africa as incomplete, in search of the secrets of Ama, the creative principle, of which he wants to, quote, gain possession, unquote. Acting with anxiety and impatience and aggressiveness, he is incessantly restless. Urugu is responsible for disorder in the universe, this being conceived in denial of the natural order, then acts to initiate and promote disharmony in the universe. In African cosmology, such a being is deficient in spiritual sensibility, is perpetually in conflict, is limited cognitively, and is threatening to the well-being of humanity. Examining the causes of global white supremacy, Marimba Ani argued that European thought implicitly believes in its own superiority, stating, quote, European culture is unique in the assertion of political interests, unquote. In Urugu, Dr. Ani proposes a tripartite conceptualization of culture based upon the concepts of 1. Asili, the central seed or germinating matrix of a culture, its essence, utamawazo, quote, culturally structured thought or world view. That's the second basis of it. Utamawazo, culturally structured thought or world view, the way in which the thought of members of a culture must be patterned if the asili is to be fulfilled. And number 3, Uta Maroho, a culture's vital force or energy source, which gives it emotional tone and motivates the collective behavior of its members. The terms that Dr. Ani uses in this framework are based on Swahili. Asili is a common Swahili word meaning origin or essence. Uta Mawazo and Uta Maroho are neologisms created by Ani, based upon the Swahili words Uta Maduni, meaning civilization, and Wazo, meaning thought, and Roho, meaning spirit life. The Utamawazo and Utamaroho are not viewed as separate from the Asili, but as its manifestations, which are, quote, born out of the Asili and in turn affirm it, unquote. Dr. Ani characterized the Asili of European culture as dominated by the concepts of separation and control, with separation establishing dichotomies like, quote, man and nature, the European and the other, thought and emotion, separations that in effect end up negating the existence of the other, who or which becomes subservient to the needs of European man. Control is disguised in universalism as in reality. Quote, the use of abstract, universal formulations in the European experience has been to control people, to impress them, and to intimidate them. According to Dr. Ani's model, the Utamawazo of European culture is structured by ideology and biocultural experience. And its Utamaroho, or vital force, is domination, reflected in all European-based structures and the imposition of Western values and civilization on peoples around the world. destroying cultures and languages in the name of progress. The book also addresses the use of the term maafa, based on a Swahili word meaning great disaster, to describe enslavement or the African Holocaust. African-centered thinkers have subsequently popularized and expanded on Dr. Ani's conceptualization, citing both the centuries-long history of enslavement and more recent examples like the Tuskegee syphilis study. Dr. Ani argued that Europeans and white Americans have, quote, an enormous capacity for the perpetration of physical violence against other cultures, unquote, that had resulted in anti-human, genocidal treatment of blacks. So, this is why we study. This is why history is so incredibly important for our continued and ongoing development. This is why we need to study history outside of the limiting box, the narrow framework of Euro-American culture, Asili. We can do this. We're going to have to be bold about it. We're going to have to be courageous about it. We're going to have to be non-apologetic about it. I have strived to be a living example of the liberating value of breaking out of this cultural matrix. The liberating value of realizing that change requires breaking out of our comfort zones. Transformation demands, from a historical perspective, that we break away from the Stockholm syndrome. That we start to realize now that we are whole and complete as individuals, within families, within communities, within ethnicities, and that ultimately the completeness of my being does encompass the completeness of my ethnicity and its role in the world in defining the future. Again, recalling the words of Samuel P. Huntington, civilization identity will be increasingly important in the future. And the world will be shaped in large measure by the interactions among 7 or 8 major civilizations, including Western, Confucian, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and undeniably African civilization. We are a global people. Of all of those civilizations mentioned, guess which one civilization has the largest number of people on the planet? African civilization. African civilization on the planet outnumbers Chinese civilization. It outnumbers the largest national population, India. If you consider India's global diaspora of 40 to 50 million people, there are more Africans on earth at 1.575 billion African people. What are we going to do with that? What are we going to do with it? Let's prevent World War VI from destroying all humanity, taking out many of the animal species along with us. Let's put an end to World War V, the global war of the corporations against our essential workers, middle class humanity. Let's take the future back. It's not going to be easy, but it will be quite rewarding. So on that note, I want to thank you all for tuning in today. to LIB Radio, LIB TV, and livinginblack.com. I hope you found this to be compelling, fascinating, interesting. I'm going to be doing 2 sessions a week now based upon the book. I do see WP33 in the house, 3 thumbs up. Hey, you are so greatly appreciated tuning in on my YouTube page. There's a little bit of a risk with this YouTube page because my last YouTube page I had for 14 plus years had 2,000 videos on it, and they canceled me out and dumped all my videos because I kept talking about the science of molecular biology, and they did not like that. So WP33, also check for us on our Rumble page. You see it in the description of today's program. Make sure you bookmark us wherever you're listening. For all of our Rumble page family, great to have you in the house today. Nobody commented but me, but we do appreciate you. Make sure you at least hit the like button. Let the algorithms know that you have found your family in a peaceful place you're on. LIB Radio, LIB TV, and livinginblack.com. Peace and prosperity to each and every one of you.